High on the rugged cliffs overlooking the roiling sea stood an old lighthouse, its white walls weathered by salt and storm. In the thick of the night, its beam shone faithfully, scattering the darkness across the crashing waves. The man who tended it, Martin Cooper, had made solitude his companion for years. He rose with the sun to wind the clockwork that rotated the beacon and carefully polished the reflecting glass before setting out to gather driftwood along the shore. The gulls recognized him, swooping down for scraps from the fish that sometimes washed ashore. Despite these daily comforts, Martin could not shake the loneliness that lingered in the corners of his mind. He had never married. He had lost his parents when he was quite young and found solace in the simple duties of a lighthouse keeper. The routine shaped his life from dawn to dusk, and his only real company was the shifting sea. Every evening just before sunset, Martin climbed the narrow spiral stairs to the lantern room. He lit the beacon, ensuring that its glass promptly reflected each flicker. The routine felt like a sacred rite, a personal vow he had made to his father, who once served as the lighthouse keeper before him. Martin remembered, even as a small boy, how important that light was. His father always said, "The sea respects only those who treat it with steadfast dedication. A single beam can mean the difference between life and death out there." At the time, Martin had not grasped the gravity of those words. But as an adult, living the exact life his father once did, he understood completely. Each ship that passed by relied on that reliable glow, and Martin made certain he never failed them. The lighthouse itself was a humble structure, crowning a rocky promontory that jutted out into the ocean. Its interior smelled of old brine and burning oil. Even though modern technology had replaced the old oil lamp system years ago, the generator, housed in a cramped shed behind the lighthouse, hummed day and night. In that remote place, Martin found small joys in the ordinary: a hot cup of coffee, the calls of seabirds, and the feel of fresh wind on his face after too many hours of indoor chores. He didn't get many visitors, except for an inspector, who showed up every 3 months to verify the generator worked properly and everything was in order. On rare summer days, the occasional adventurous tourist or curious beachcomber might spot the solitary figure on the cliff and call out a greeting. Yet, once they departed, the world seemed to recede again, leaving Martin in that austere silence. The day the storm came was one that had started like any other. The morning sunrise glowed in gentle shades of pink and orange, bathing the horizon in warmth and promise. Martin had made his way down to the shoreline looking for driftwood. He could sense a slight shift in the wind, an odd hush lingering over the water, certainly different from the typical breezy days. By mid-afternoon, dark, menacing clouds began crawling in from the horizon. Martin kept a watchful eye as the air grew thick and humid. He hurried to secure the windows of the lighthouse and checked again that the generator was functioning. The shift from day to night seemed abrupt. A sudden flash of lightning in the distance warned him that the storm would arrive soon. At dusk, fierce winds whipped along the coastline, rattling the shutters. The radio in Martin's small living quarters crackled to life with a burst of static. He momentarily paused, startled by the unexpected sound, and adjusted the volume. Through the static, a faint voice pleaded, "Mayday! This is the Silver Wave. Engines down. Adrift in heavy storm. Coordinates." The broadcast dissolved into crackling noise. Martin's heart thudded in his chest. The Silver Wave, he recalled, was a mid-sized cargo vessel known to make runs for supplies between small coastal towns. If their engines had failed, they would be at the mercy of the waves and the turbulent weather. He recognized the urgency. With the storm intensifying, the boundary between safety and danger was narrower than ever. He sprinted upstairs to the lantern room, nearly slipping on the wet steps. The beam was already on, but he needed to ensure it was at full brightness. The wind hammered against the glass dome. Rain pelted it so hard that each strike sounded like a small bullet. Martin checked the mechanism, the bulbs, the spare bulbs, and then ran back down to the radio. "The Silver Wave, come in. This is White Cliff Bay Lighthouse," he called out. He carefully repeated the phrase, enunciating each word, giving coordinates. He added, I have the beacon at full brightness. If you can see the light, steer toward it. The waters are shallower around the cape to the east, so avoid drifting too close to the western cliffs. The line buzzed with static. He tried again and again, but the storm's fury seemed to scramble any attempt at clear communication. Finally, a faint response. We see light, trying. Then it was gone. Nonetheless, Martin felt a surge of relief. They had seen the light. That would be enough, he hoped. Outside, the night descended into chaos. Lightning slashed the dark sky, illuminating gargantuan waves, cresting and breaking in the distance. Each thunderclap rattled Martin to the marrow. Gusts of wind roared across the promontory, yanking at the metal siding of the lighthouse's exterior. Martin's heart raced as he climbed again to the lantern room for yet another check. The tower swayed like a sturdy tree trunk bending in gale force winds, each movement a chilling reminder of just how easily nature could swallow a person's endeavors. He circled the lens, wiped the condensation, and adjusted the aperture so the beam would extend as far as possible through sheets of rain. Years of routine might have lulled him into believing nights like these were nearly impossible or rare. Yet here he was, reminded once again that being a lighthouse keeper was not merely about flipping a switch. It was about standing guard at the boundary between safety and oblivion. Looking out to sea, he spotted a faint light flickering in the distance, perhaps the cargo ship attempting to signal him. He prayed the vessel could hold out against the raging surf. If their engines remained inoperative, it would be only a matter of time before they were driven toward the rocky coastline. Martin forced himself to breathe. Adrenaline was coursing through him, but panic threatened to cloud his judgment. He needed to be steadfast. Hours dragged on, and the storm refused to let up. The wind shrieked around the tower, making the windows sing a menacing tune. Around 1 a.m, the radio crackled again. Lightcliff Bay Lighthouse. Losing control. Can't hold. The voice dissolved in a rumble of static. Martin ventured outside in his raincoat, despite the hurricane-like blast that threatened to sweep him away. He locked the door behind him. Using his flashlight, he made his way along the edge of the cliff. Waves pounded the base of the escarpment, sending plumes of sea spray so high they touched the fringe of the precipice. Looking to his left, he saw a brief flash, perhaps, a distress flare from the ship. Instantly, Martin realized it hadn't drifted to the east as he had advised. Strong currents must have forced it toward the more dangerous western cliffs. He had to do something else, illuminate the threat so they could avoid ramming into the jagged rocks. He turned and scrambled back inside, feet squelching in puddles. He would have to manipulate the angles of the lighthouse beam manually, turning it to shine westward rather than focusing on the open sea. For the first time in many years, he found himself wishing he had a second set of hands. With breath coming in ragged gasps, Martin rushed to the upper deck, fighting the gale every step. Rain battered his face, and his slicker whipped around him like a tattered banner. He reached the external balcony that circled under the lamp. From a small metal box mounted there, he pulled out an emergency searchlight. It was portable and designed for signals. Attaching it to a mount on the railing, he aimed it toward the western side of the promontory. Hands trembling, he flipped the switch. The beam cut through the night, albeit not nearly as powerfully as the main lighthouse lamp. But it might make a difference. At the least, it could highlight the looming rocks, giving the silver wave a visual reference to steer clear. Lightning revealed the cargo ship momentarily, listing in the monstrous waves. It seemed the vessel was being tossed like a toy between towering walls of water. Martin's heart clenched. He flicked the searchlight on and off, attempting to send a pattern or signal that might guide them away from the deadly reef. But from that distance, everything just looked terrifyingly close. The seconds felt interminable. Then, in a flash of lightning, he noticed the ship leaning dangerously as waves hammered its starboard side. It disappeared behind a great curtain of water before reemerging. The radio remained silent. Martin poured every ounce of will into that flickering searchlight, praying it would be enough to keep the ship navigationally oriented. He stayed there for what felt like ages, switching the beam on and off, ignoring the deep chill seeping into his bones. Over the wind's roar, he heard the haunting groan of metal from the ship's hull. He clutched the railing so tightly his knuckles ached. Rain drenched every layer of his clothing. His hair clung to his forehead in wet clumps. Strength began to wane, his breath came in ragged draws, but he felt a responsibility so profound it superseded physical exhaustion. Hundreds of times he had rotated the lamp for passing ships, never once looking them in the eye or sharing a word. Yet, in that moment, he felt intimately connected to the silver waves, every soul on board relying on this one unwavering light for hope. Suddenly, the shape of the vessel shifted. It was turning. The bow began slowly pivoting away from the jagged spines of the cliff. Martin's eyes widened. The radio came to life again, though barely. A sputter, then, "Lighthouse, see you! Turning east, God help us!" Martin clenched his jaw and continued signaling. He wanted to shout, though he knew they couldn't hear him. He wanted to tell them, "Keep going! You're almost free!" The seas were savage, but now that their course was angled diagonally to the onslaught, they stood a better chance of escaping the worst of the breaker. Wave after towering wave crashed into them, but the silhouette kept creeping eastward, away from the lethal reefs. Martin stayed there, never turning away for fear that even a second of lost light might mean disaster. By the time the ship gained a safer distance, the storm had only slightly abated. The wind still howled, but the thunder was less deafening. Martin flicked off the auxiliary searchlight, trusting that the main beacon would now be enough to guide the freighter toward calmer water. A surge of relief coursed through him, making his muscles quiver. For what felt like hours, he remained leaning on the railing, gazing after the faint lights of the silver wave until it disappeared behind the curtain of rain. Finally, exhaustion compelled him to retreat inside. He peeled off his soaked coat and sank into the wooden chair by the radio. Static hummed in the background. No further transmissions came in that night. He sat there until the first pale light of dawn broke over the stormy horizon, eventually dozing off. Morning arrived quietly, as if the tempest of the night before had never taken place. Sunlight began to pierce the gray clouds, illuminating the cliffs and the violent churn of the sea below. Martin woke with a start, stiff and shivering. He was still in damp clothes. He rose to inspect the shoreline, anxious to find out what had become of the silver wave. Peering from the narrow windows, he scanned the horizon. Nothing. Possibly they had drifted further out and found safety. Or perhaps they had landed in a cove beyond the cape. After downing a quick cup of coffee, Martin put on dry clothes and ventured outside. The wind still gusted, though nowhere near as fiercely as before. Carefully, he navigated the slippery path down toward the western cliffs. Rocks glistened in the morning light, seaweed and foam strewn across the ledges. The gulls circled overhead, cawing their routine pleas for scraps. At the water's edge, he saw shards of wood and twisted scraps of metal washed ashore, debris, possibly from the storm, though not necessarily from the silver wave. Fear seized him as he contemplated the possibility the ship might have split somewhere unseen. He pressed on, searching for any sign of life. As he rounded a bend, he spotted movement on the next stretch of shoreline, figures dressed in bright neon jackets. A cluster of men and women worked together to tug a lifeboat farther up the beach, where it would be safe from the crash of the waves. He quickened his pace, almost stumbling in his eagerness to help. Sure enough, upon closer inspection, the peeling letters on the lifeboat side read, "The Silver Wave." Relief and concern mingled in Martin's chest. He called out to them, waving his arms above his head. Immediately, a few of the survivors gestured back, beckoning him over. They looked cold, drenched, and exhausted, but they were alive. Puffing from the effort of climbing over the slick rocks, Martin arrived at their makeshift camp. A tall man with a weather-beaten face introduced himself as Captain Reyes. His breeches were tattered and he was nursing a gash on his forearm, but his voice remained firm. "We owe you our lives," the captain said, shaking Martin's hand with surprising vigor. "Your lighthouse beam was the only reason we managed to steer clear of the rocks. Our engines gave out. Our backup generator short-circuited. We tried to drop anchor, but the chain snapped in the gale." Each sentence felt weighted with honesty and gratitude. Martin tried to deflect the praise, mumbling that it was his duty, yet he could not hide the flicker of warmth that ignited within him. The sincerity in the captain's gaze reminded him that, indeed, his father's words rang true. A single beam meant the difference between life and death that night. The crew of the Silver Wave had come ashore using a lifeboat. According to Captain Reyes, the ship was afloat but heavily waterlogged, drifting along the coast in the early hours of morning until they deemed it necessary to abandon it. Martin insisted they follow him back to the lighthouse, where they could at least seek shelter and radio for a proper rescue. With gratitude in their eyes, they gathered their meager supplies and climbed behind him the winding path up the bluff. The wet wind whipped around them, and occasionally a crew member stumbled, still shaken by the night's ordeal. Martin offered a supporting hand to anyone who needed it. The slow climb felt oddly comforting to him, a reversal of his years of solitude. Now he led a small procession of souls who trusted him implicitly. Upon reaching the lighthouse, Martin ushered them inside. The cramped quarters, up against a dozen people, felt downright crowded. Yet he found the closeness invigorating, like a bustling family gathered in a modest living room. Some crew members perched on the narrow staircase that led to the lamp room. Others huddled near a portable heater Martin set up, grateful for every hint of warmth. He fetched blankets, rummaged in his pantry for whatever provisions he had, tinned soup, coffee, crackers, and some dried fish he kept for emergencies. Soon, the tight space filled with the aroma of hot broth. Despite the night's terror, a gentle sense of camaraderie replaced tension. A young sailor, hardly more than 19, slurped a spoonful of soup and gazed at Martin with wide, earnest eyes. I just want to say thank you, he stammered. I was so scared last night, hearing those waves slam into the hull. Then I saw your lighthouse beacon. It was like hope itself shining out of the darkness. His voice cracked. Martin patted the youth's shoulder gently and nodded, words failing him. He had never quite been comfortable receiving praise, but his heart warmed with each expression of gratitude. Captain Reyes took a seat on an old wooden stool near the radio. He peeled off his soaked jacket, revealing a black short-sleeve shirt and tattooed arms. We tried so hard to keep her running, he said, a note of tenderness for his ship. But it all happened so fast. 1 minute, the wind is roaring, the next minute, the engine's dead. My crew fought valiantly to weigh anchor, but we were at the mercy of the storm. He exhaled a shaky breath and ran a hand through salt-stiff hair. We might have died if we hadn't spotted your beam. Martin felt a familiar catch in his throat. He had always understood the lighthouse's importance in the abstract. Yes, it was crucial for navigation. Yes, it saved nameless, faceless sailors from harm. But hearing these words, people acknowledging the moment they saw his light, the moment hope sparked, was altogether different. It was oddly humbling. He was simply a keeper, fulfilling a role generations old, yet through that role, he became someone's lifeline. Time passed in a hushed hum of quiet voices, the clink of spoons on bowls, and the hiss of the small heater. Martin showed them how to operate his radio set with better clarity than the battered handheld transmitters from their lifeboat. Together, they managed to contact the nearest Coast Guard station, which promised assistance within a few hours. Outside, sunlight battled with the thinning clouds, promising a calmer afternoon. The internal tension of the night before gradually gave way to weary relief. Some crew members dozed off in corners, lulled by the comfort of warmth and safety. When rescue boats arrived later that day, they anchored offshore where the seas were calmer and sent a dinghy to the rocky beach. Medical professionals came with first aid kits, checking the crew for injuries. Captain Reyes lingered behind to speak with Martin before he boarded the small craft that would ferry them away. The two men stood together near the base of the lighthouse, gulls screeching overhead. The captain looked out at the horizon, which now sparkled with deceptive tranquility. "Thank you, once more," he said. "I wish we had something more formal to give you. We owe you a debt." He pulled off his navigator's watch, a sturdy, water-resistant timepiece scuffed with years of service. Holding it out to Martin, he added softly, "My father gave this to me when I became captain. I'd be honored if you kept it, as a reminder that your light saved us." Martin hesitated, humbled by the gesture. He glanced at the watch face, its ticking second hand undaunted by salt or storm. Much like the lighthouse, it was a symbol of guidance and endurance. Slowly, Martin closed his fingers over the watch. "I'll take good care of it," he assured the captain. "But you owe me nothing. I'm just glad you and your crew are alive." A faint grin ghosted across Reyes's face, and he extended his hand for a firm shake. "Sometimes a man's duty is more than just a job. You saved lives. That might not mean the world to everyone out there, but it means the world to us." The captain's eyes glistened with genuine tears as he turned to follow his sailors, leaving Martin standing near the lighthouse in awe of how a single night could transform so many lives. After the rescue boat departed, the lighthouse returned to its familiar hush. Yet, Martin felt a subtle shift in the air, as though the space was filled with echoes of the newly departed voices. The watch glinted in his hand, a tangible reminder that he was never truly alone in this work. Each action, no matter how routine it seemed, had the potential to weave companionship into the fabric of the world. Stepping back inside, he gazed up at the spiral staircase leading to the beacon's heart. Sunlight cast stripes on the wall through the narrow windows. Though his body still buzzed with fatigue, he felt a rush of purpose. Throwing open the shutters to let in more of the morning light, he made his way up to the lantern room. Standing among the gears, mirrors, and prisms, Martin thought of how many ships had passed safely by, guided by this steadfast apparatus and the careful attention he'd provided. He thought about his father, who had once taught him that the job of a lighthouse keeper was to shine a guiding light even when no one seemed to be looking. To Martin, that task had been purely obligatory for so many years, something to do to fill the empty hours. Yet after last night, he understood the significance anew. The human spirit craves guidance when lost, and a single beam can be the lifeline that keeps hope afloat. Some days later, as the storm's memory faded, Martin noticed a small cluster of letters and packages arriving at the nearest post office, specifically addressed to him. Word had traveled with the rescue crew of Whitecliff Bay's compassionate lighthouse keeper. A few were from families of the sailors expressing tearful thanks that their fathers, spouses, and children had been spared. One letter came from a stranger who read about the incident and wanted Martin to know how his story of unwavering kindness had reaffirmed her faith in humanity. Another arrived from one of the rescued mariners, describing how he felt his life had been given a second chance. Martin took each letter upstairs to the lightroom and read them quietly, tears forming at the corners of his eyes. He carefully put them away in a small metal box, treasures that attested to a profound bond linking him to countless lives beyond the horizon. Days rolled on, but Martin no longer found the familiar silence so daunting. He sensed a hum of gratitude filling the corridors, a kind of echo that reminded him he was part of humanity's grand mosaic. Each night, as the lamp whirred into motion, he felt a renewed reverence for the responsibility resting on his shoulders. He tended the generator with extra care, polished the glass to a flawless sheen, and made sure the backup systems were in prime condition. Though life in the lighthouse continued much as before, Martin carried within him a deeper awareness of what that light represented. Occasionally, late at night, he took Captain Reyes's watch out and held it under the lantern's glow. He listened to it tick, a tiny heartbeat in the lonely tower. It comforted him, an emblem of resilience. Sometimes the wind whispered through the cracks in the stone, almost as if the sea was letting out a wistful sigh, but Martin was no longer uneasy. The darkness outside might be vast, the ocean's dangers endless, yet he had learned that even the most desolate place could become a haven, a sanctuary of hope, when illuminated by compassion. He recognized that all it took was one steadfast light to show a path forward. Standing on the catwalk in the hush of twilight, Martin surveyed the horizon as the day's last colors faded. The sea shimmered with the final reflections of sun, but soon it would be swallowed by the expanding night. Flipping the switch, he had the privilege of watching the lighthouse lamp ignite once more, spinning its bright beam out into the nothingness. He inhaled deeply, the salty air filling his lungs. The world might not know his name, but they would know his light. And if even one soul out on that boundless expanse found safe passage because of it, that was all the recognition he needed. He remained there for some time, listening to the faint roar of the water. Loneliness no longer felt like the central strand of his life, though nothing in his external reality had changed. The sense of isolation gave way to something else, a tender knowledge that by simply being present and shining his light, he was making an immeasurable difference in the lives of others. Some nights, a distant horn would sound from a passing ship, a courteous salute in the dark, and Martin would lift his hand in silent greeting. Even if they could not see him, he felt innately connected to them, traveler and guide, both adrift in the mysteries of existence, relying on one another more than any of them realized. After all, he mused, one light sometimes stands for all the hope there is. Through the swirl of darkness and the storm's roar, a single ray can remind us that we are not lost, that help can be found, often in the least expected places. Even a lonely keeper on a forgotten cliff can become a beacon for countless souls, illuminating their path home. This warm, certain knowledge glowed within Martin, gently mirroring the beam that swept across the boundless, waiting sea.